Observers around the world are watching, of course, what has happened in the United States the last few years. They've seen a deadly insurrection, sacking of the nation's capital, its president impeached twice, indicted 4 times, facing trial, possibly still poised to take back power. The country's Speaker of the House position made vacant by allies of the corrupt ex-president, and also the increasing political violence being carried out across the country by his followers. You can understand they quite understandably worry about the stability of this country and what that means for the world. Michael Beschloss is NBC News presidential historian, and he joins me now. Michael, one thing I always try to tell myself when I try to get too presentist is that, the U.S. has been through periods of pretty intense political violence, obviously the Civil War and the political violence Reconstruction, but in the 1920s, during the 1960s. So I want to put things in a historical perspective. I'm curious where you sort of see us right now in that sense.
Well, it's a violent country. It's not the only thing to know about America, but just as you're saying, slavery was continuous violence for centuries, violence against Native Americans. And just as you're saying, the Civil War and Jim Crow, and also in the early 1960s, for instance, after John Kennedy sent a big civil rights bill to Congress, if you look at his FBI files, the number of death threats against President Kennedy rose. 1990s, the violence against the federal government, both threatened and actual. Oklahoma City, the bombing of a building, other domestic terrorist threatening. But the difference between that time and this time is this. In the 1990s, for instance, when those threats were there, when the actual tragedy of Oklahoma City happened in 1995, we could rely on the President of the United States, both parties in Congress and across the country, to say that violence of this kind is outside the American system and has to be stopped. Peace has to be restored. Now we're in a situation where many more guns in America, gun safety laws have been relaxed, and you've got one of the two parties, the Republican Party, absolutely seduced by Donald Trump, who loves violence, who, when he was president, threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act or martial law to stop violence. This is now in the heart of America, not on the fringe.
Yeah, and that point about what you might call organic political violence by certain factions, and it might be quite sophisticated or deadly in the case of the Oklahoma City bombing. Sure. But that is the difference, that the person who is the nominee, likely to be the nominee of one of the two major parties, the leader of that party, his countenancing of it, his encouraging. I mean, one of the most chilling moments, I didn't even mention it, but I want to bring it up here, and we're not going to play it because it's actually too despicable to do so. But he was in that room in California at a fundraiser, and he made a joke about Speaker Pelosi's husband, who was, savagely attacked, an 80-year-old man in his home. He says, "How's he doing?" And the crowd roars. And that, to me, the message that sends to anyone that wants to do something horrible is that he's got your back, that he approves of it. And that, to me, seems really pretty unique and uniquely dangerous.
That's it. And in modern times, when did we ever hear a president or an ex-president ever say something remotely like that and people applaud and it gets normalized? Plus, in modern times, domestic terrorists and people like the one that assaulted Paul Pelosi, perhaps, these people can now contact each other on the dark web. They couldn't do that in Jim Crow, Alabama in 1925. Right. This is a very new period. And so if you get a possible next president of the United States, if Donald Trump is elected 13 months from today exactly, or if someone like Jim Jordan becomes Speaker of the House, just as you were saying earlier, Chris, where was he on January 6th? Why can't he remember what kind of conversations he had or did not have with Donald Trump at a time that Donald Trump may have been running that whole operation to wage a coup d'etat and conquer Congress? 1/3 of our Supreme Court was appointed by Donald Trump. We're not in a situation that we might have been in, let's say, in the 90s, where we could depend on all three branches of our government to protect us against this kind of violence.
Yeah, and there's also the question of federal law enforcement and what they do about it. And obviously, this is a long-standing question. I mean, you have huge attacks against federal law enforcement in the 90s, and what happened at Waco and Ruby Ridge, providing inspiration for folks like Timothy McVeigh. And of course, a very tortured and complicated legacy of how the FBI has dealt with this, right? I mean, incredibly despicable acts in COINTELPRO and things they did in the Red Scare, but also going after the Klan in the South. You've got this situation now where the FBI is seen as the deep state, and any motions they start to make to try to deal with this is immediately subject to a political backlash in Congress and on Fox News.
And what has Donald Trump said? He has said flat out, elect me president, I will neutralize the FBI, which is a malign organization. I'll do the same thing with the Department of Justice. And I will essentially point lackeys at the Pentagon. Can I say one more thing, Chris?
Please.
What you were saying at the beginning, which was brilliant and trenchant, we should all pay attention to your warning, reminded me a little bit of Franklin Roosevelt, who was very aware of vulnerable populations in the United States. In the late 1930s, he said privately, direct quote, he said, if a demagogue ever took up anti-Semitic violence in America, he said, there would be more blood running in the streets of New York City than in Berlin. You need a president who understands that this potential is there to protect every American against that, not to try to encourage it.
Well said. Michael Beschloss, thank you very much. Appreciate it.